Okay, good evening everyone. I think we should make a start. So welcome to this Quality Meat Scotland webinar, which aims to get to the root of outwintering young stock. Outwintering young stock has gained popularity recently from Shetland to the borders and is now becoming the new normal on many farms. I'm joined by Beth Alexander, cattle and sheep specialist at QMS, David Aglen, a farm manager from Balbirnie Home Farms in Fife, and Duncan Morrison from Meco Morton in Aberdeenshire. Right, firstly, a little bit of housekeeping. The meeting is getting recorded and will be available after the event. And secondly, we're really keen for you guys to get involved in the meeting tonight. We'd like it to be more of a chat rather than just a webinar. So to do that, we've got various options. Any technical issues with the webinar should be raised in the chat function at the bottom. Any questions for the panelists can be put into the question and answer section. And if you would like to join the discussion, click on the raise hand. That will get flagged up, and then Beth will let you into the discussion, and then you can speak and share your experiences. You don't need a camera for that, but you do need a microphone if you'd like to speak. Okay, so agenda for this evening. We'll go over why we're here tonight discussing outwintering young stock. We'll hear from our two farmers and have a bit of discussion with them afterwards. They're here to share their experiences, but also because they need your guys' help. They've said that they're willing to discuss what they're doing, but they're definitely not experts. So take it from there. And next we'll move on to, could outwintering work for you on your farm? And then some next steps, and we'll close. Now, before we go any further, it wouldn't be a proper webinar without a poll. So we're going to start tonight with the first poll. Can you bring that up, Beth? So what is your experience of outwintering cattle? Just to get an idea of who's in the audience and what they're doing on farm.
I think we've got most people voted there, John.
Yep, that's good. So let's see the results then. Okay, so it's probably roughly what we expected. Plenty outwintering of cows and heifers, young stock not so much, and a few farms that are still housing everything. We'd just like to confirm before we move on that tonight we're really just focusing on young stock. And as the speakers will probably comment on later, cows is one thing, young stock seems to be a totally different beast altogether. Okay, so why are we discussing outwintering young stock? As I said before, it's gained popularity recently. I don't know why, but here are a few possible reasons. There's been an increase in interest in growing fodder wheat in Scotland for in situ grazing over the last few years, partly since the last monitor farm project. Fodder wheat offers the potential of really good live weight gains out at forage, which works well with young stock. Another possible option is a move towards more forage-based systems. Also, producers are looking for new ways to reduce costs, including labour, variable costs, and fixed costs. Also, increasingly, people are more interested in non-medical ways of improving calf health, and not housing them is potentially one of those. Now, this might be another reason why, or it's just a happy coincidence. But if you look at these figures of calf registrations in Scotland over the last 10 years, the overall number hasn't changed massively, but the distribution between breeds has quite significantly. So comparing 2020 to 2010, the Angus and other native breeds has gone up by 48%. So it's really taken a big share of the sires registered, and that's been probably not as a surprise. That's come as at expense of the continentals. So a big hit in Charleys and Limousins and Simmentals. These native breeds are definitely more suited to these forage-based systems, and potentially more suited to outwintering. Okay, so we're going to move to our first panelist tonight. Duncan Morrison farms in Meikle, Maldron and Upper Ingliston in Aberdeenshire, where he runs over 100 pure Angus, Angus cross and Stabiliser cows. Simplicity is key for Duncan as he farms alongside his fencing business. This is his first year outwintering young stock. However, he has outwintered cows for the past 5 years. Over to you, Duncan, if you'd like to share your experiences this year.
Cheers, John. Yeah, just as John said, I'm trying to implement the simplest and cheapest system that I can possibly implement. I started farming myself around 5 years ago, and if there's anyone out there that's done something similar, you'll probably know that it's quite difficult to fund these sorts of things, particularly with suckler cows. It's bordering on madness, to be honest. But I went ahead with it because cows are what I know. So as a result of that, everything has to be cheap. Everything has to be done on a budget, and that was probably one of the main drivers that got me outwintering cows. And I found that an absolute dream. I love it. The cows calve outside, and they're basically outside their whole life. And I'm just trying to develop a system each year to make it better every time. We're on around 100 cows here in Meikle Maldron, which is a tenanted farm, and all the stock now is we're heading towards finishing, whereas before we're selling various ages from weaning all the way through to sort of forward stores. So we're looking to finish now, and in November we took on a leasing agreement with another farmer. So between our cows and his cows, we're on about 220 overall. They're mainly Stabiliser cows that we're leasing, and majority of our herd are Anguses. So the two breeds we found were you know, quite suited to outwintering. So I decided to sort of maybe go the next step and see if we could outwinter some of the young stock. I decided to go for potential bull and heifers, mainly because I felt as if they were maybe slightly less risk to do it in the first year. I felt as if I didn't make a good job of it, and I was expecting to be selling these in the spring, you know, then the pocket could take a bit of a hit. Whereas I felt if the bull and heifers were going to be on the farm for a longer period, hopefully, you know, 10 years plus, then a bit of a mistake or several mistakes might not affect the pocket quite as much. The sort of two main reasons why I decided to pursue this was the fact that because we're increasing the stock numbers by quite a bit, well, a huge amount. We're 4 times as much as we had before. I felt as if we're maybe potentially going to have a bit of a shortage of sheds in the next couple of years. So I felt as if I could make this system work this year, then there's a potential that it could work in the coming years, and it might alleviate some of the shed space problems. The second issue that I was thinking about was the fact that we've got a bit of an aspiration to be selling breeding stock, pedigree and commercial heifers and bulls from our herd. We've got a pedigree Angus herd, and we're now dabbling in stabilisers. So I firmly believe that people who are selling breeding stock, be that pedigree or commercial, should be testing their stock. They should be challenged as much as, if not more than, the average commercial farmer. So I'm hoping to sort of achieve a system that I can say to a potential customer that, you know, I've tested these heifers or bulls, you know, in my system, and I know for a fact that they're going to work in yours. You know, these heifers are going to calve at 2 years old. They'll be bulled in the spring. They were born outside themselves. They weren't creep fed. So, you know, if I can bring them through the winter, get them in calf, and they go on and calve outside themselves too, and wean out a good weight, then I think they've done pretty well. And I think I'd have quite a lot of confidence in the fact that they go on and do well for someone else too. So that's sort of the two main drivers for it. John, do you want me to speak a little bit about the mistakes that I made at the moment, or do you just move on to David?
Maybe not the mistakes quite yet. Just a wee overview of your system, if that's okay.
Yeah. So these bull and heifers, or they're not even bull and heifers yet. They've been on Red Start. We chose Red Start because I'm not very good at anything arable related, so I felt as if Red Start was quite an easy option. It was literally a case of plough the field and power harrow it. Seed was broadcast 3 kilos an acre, and we just let it go. No spraying or fertilizer, because I'm a cheapskate, so we just let it go. And it was a decent yield actually. The picture you can see is actually the worst bit that there is. The start of the field that we're at, it was about the height of the fence posts, so it was pretty decent. And alongside the Red Start, they were given silage. I tried my best to do my calculations so that the bales were spaced out just in line with where they were going to need it, and I think I got that pretty much right. But there were a few problems in that we can speak about later with the silage and stuff. But overall, I think I got my calculations right. They're now off the crop because although I got my calculations right, I made some other mistakes, which meant that they went through the crop quite quickly, and they're now on to deferred grass, which is in the field, the other side of the bales that you can see in the picture. So they're still getting on fine. Haven't weighed them yet, but we will be weighing them in the next couple of weeks. I'm not expecting huge growth, but going by eye, they're thriving pretty well, and you can tell by their behaviour on a nasty day. They don't you know, rushed to the side for shelter and stuff. They're still grazing as if you know, it wasn't any bad weather at all. So I think they've stood up to the system pretty well, and looking forward to getting them to the bull in the spring. And the really positive thing about the whole thing is we've realised so quickly about all the bad mistakes that we've made. So we're quite confident that we can make a better job of it next year.
Okay, thanks for that, Duncan. And the audience can come up with some burning questions, and I know that they'll want to quiz you about all these mistakes. So next up, we've got David Aglen, farm manager at Balbirnie Home Farms in Fife. The 2,900 acre arable, vegetable and livestock business runs a herd of about 180 Simmental cross cows. I was lucky enough to visit the farm 3 years ago with a group of locals, where David had 50 calves on kale, a big straw bale corral in one corner, an awful lot of mud, but the calves look great, and the system has obviously developed from there. So over to you, David.
Thanks, John. Good evening, everybody. You're not supposed to mention the mud, John, but we'll let you away with it. Yes, this is our third year of outwintering our calves, and I'll be perfectly honest with you, it's purely financial reasons. We couldn't make it stand up on our business, putting calves in a shed and feeding them all winter, with the machinery and labour and all sorts. It was just costing us too much money. Other businesses might be different, but that was what was relative to us. We're also trying to farm the whole business in what's becoming the popular thing to chat about now, which is a more regenerative fashion. And part of this is trying to integrate the livestock into the arable areas of the farm, more so than historically has been the case. Essentially the farm is made up of roughly 3/4 arable and 1/4 grassland, and the grassland is basically ground you could plough up, but it's not so suitable. It's a bit higher up the hill, a bit later in the season, so it's just ended up being grass all the time. The livestock have essentially been kept on those areas each year, since, you know, for a good long time. And like most arable farms, we've moved away from putting stock on the other fields, and they've just purely been for arable. But we felt the fertility is starting to slip away on the arable ground, even with 180 cows. We did have a few more last year, but we slimmed down a little bit. We just weren't able to produce enough dung to cover the amount of arable ground we've got on a regular enough basis. So we just sat down and looked at the whole system and thought, well, if you look at the cows themselves, they've got a harvester at the front, there's a processing system in the middle, and they'll spread the dung from you at the back. And that's you know, it's not free, but it doesn't involve any machinery or labour. So we've thought we'd try and make most use of that. And excuse me, John, bed, please.
Do you like my house?
Yes, thank you.
It's got my turtle and my dragon.
Okay, good. Right, apologies for that.
Night night.
Okay, farmer for the future, hopefully. Where was I? Yeah, so we thought I feel that as a business, we've been guilty of developing our business to pander to the cattle, as it were, the livestock in general, and actually we ought to make more of these animals as assets and make them do more of the work for us. As a total, we were spending throughout the whole year 22 days a year mucking out cattle sheds for the whole business. And when you put that together as one block of time, and think that basically we spend 3 weeks mucking out sheds, it starts to seem a bit daft to me. So as John said, we started out 3 years ago with a group of 50, and it was a bit muddy. We did make provision for a dry lie, etc. But you can't control exactly where the calves want to be, and a lot of the time they just wanted to stay outside and stay off the dry lie and be muddy a bit, really. But as they got more area, it improved and they thrived. We didn't have a huge lot of pneumonia. We were still vaccinating for pneumonia at that time because we were just trying it, one step at a time. The growth rate through the winter was about 0.6, 0.7 kilos a day, which, as it says there, now that seemed disappointing compared to other cattle that were in the shed at the time, and they were doing 1 to 1.2 kilos at the same time. So performance-wise, you could argue that it wasn't up to scratch. But when we looked at the costs, so the feed cost alone, that first year we did it, the feed cost outside was 25% of the feed cost inside. And to be honest, I haven't really monitored it since then. It's maybe a bit similar, maybe a bit more, but that number alone was a huge difference, big enough difference for us to change. So the second year, we got a bit braver and we put half the calves on the kale. So that was about 100. That was last winter. We made a bit more provision for dry lying areas that year, and that seemed to work. And then, well, this year it was like, well, we're not going to put calves inside, so we just put the whole lot as 180 in that mob that you see there in the picture. 180 calves is a much bigger deal than dealing with 100, we've discovered. When you've got 720 hooves on the ground versus 400, it gets mucky an awful lot quicker. And that's despite giving them plenty area that we thought and sufficient feed. We have had a few struggles with that in the worst of the weather. We were lucky in that we set the field out in such a way that we could alter the grazing faces to kind of move to drier ground when it got really bad, and that certainly helped a huge amount. Yeah, so that's where we are. The calves go onto grass. They've got about another week of kale left, and then we've got some vegetable crops we can put them on for a bit, and then they'll go on to rye, which is grown as a cover crop over the winter after cereals, and they'll go on to forage rye in about 3 weeks time, 3 to 4 weeks time. And they'll be strip grazed across that until kind of 3rd or 4th week of April, and then they'll be mob grazed on grass for the summer, moved on to multi-species cover crop later in the summer for a month or so, and then back onto grass. We're not 100% sure how many we'll manage to finish yet. We managed to finish some last year, but not all of them. We ended up putting a lot away as decent sized stores, and economically it worked. It worked really well. The intention would be to try and finish them all eventually, but we've got a lot to learn to get that job sussed yet. And yeah, that's where we are. That's what we're doing. That's what we're trying, and we just move forwards and improve it every year.
Okay, that's great, David. Thank you. So we should get stuck into some questions. We've got a couple here one from Duncan Morrison and Michael Blanche, who are asking kind of similar about. Duncan's asking how many stock days per hectare or other measure. So, and Michael's asking kind of similar about how to measure the yield and estimate how much you need for your calves. So, did you do a simple measurement of cutting and weighing and working it out on a dry matter basis?
I didn't do any of that. So I just went. Well, obviously I hadn't. When I planned the acres, it was ended up being just 7 acres that I put in, and I'd budgeted for 40, 320 kilos. I think they maybe were 300 kilos calves. I just, because I hadn't done it before, I don't know how it's all going to pan out. I just used sort of average figures for average yields, and by the time I knew exactly, it was a little bit poor planning really. So that's one of the mistakes that we did, that we just didn't really plan properly enough. It was a bit of a try and see. So I think if I was going to go next year, well, I will go again next year. We'll try and make a better job of measuring and properly budgeting, and also we'll not make the same mistakes again, which we haven't covered yet. But I just used our average figures, but I was planning for around about 120 days on the crop, and I think they're around about 110 or 100 that before we pulled them off. But I might as well say why. Basically, I made a complete cock up with the run back. I decided to have like a running run back, so like you had a strip of grass alongside the red start. So alongside the crop, there's a strip of grass, maybe 20 meters wide, where I laid out the bales. Which seemed good in theory, but I think, well, David and I spoke on Friday night, and he put it nice properly, that if you're moving the feed face by like 2 meters, 20 meters wide by 2 meters deep, it's not an awful lot of ground, so it gets mudded up just the same as the rest of the field does. So I'd maybe put too much of my eggs in the basket of having this strip down the side, and I didn't have a big enough run back for a start. And obviously I had a really bad November, December for weather. It was just absolute lashing rain. So because of that, we ended up giving them big scalps of crop to try and give them more space and to keep them content, which worked, but it meant that we probably wasted quite a lot of crop for a start, and it meant that it cocked up the figures a little bit. So they're all the way through the crop now, and they're onto the grass next door. So if we made a better job of the run back, and I think my calculations probably would have worked out properly, I think, otherwise. But the other questions were, I see there's a question about the snow. They got on absolutely fine in the snow. They're surprisingly well. There's a few days we were a little bit worried about them, but they were absolutely fine. We're so surprised, pleasantly surprised, but they got on great.
A good bit of hard weather rather than wind and rain wouldn't be the worst thing, I'd imagine, for stock anyway.
Yeah.
A question here for David from Debbie McGowan. Did the outdoor wintered calves ever catch up on the indoor ones?
I suppose the honest answer to that is no. The indoor ones were always a bit ahead. But we're looking at the cost of running the business, and I wonder whether we get, in the past, our business has been guilty of being too concerned about the performance numbers. When we were, as you see at the bottom of the slide there, we were running a very intensive barley beef system, and we were finishing, our average finishing age for stocks and heifers indoors was 14 months. And it was fantastic. You know, performance-wise, you thought you were hitting the peak, you were doing everything you should be doing, and it was working, but it was just costing us far too much money. I think to do that system, you've got to have a vast number of animals in the shed, and we just couldn't get to that point. So rather than, I'm less concerned about performance on a daily basis now. It's more about the performance of the whole animal within the system. And yes, the animals aren't as heavy as they were in the past, but when I look at the budget and the money that the cattle are generating, or so I say, not losing now, it's a much rosier picture, and it looks much more positive for cattle to stay at Balbirnie in the future. I hope that answers your question, David.
Yeah, I think in your case as well, David, it's the move to this whole bigger farming system, isn't it? And even though you've got barley and you've got straw and you've got sheds, if you can make it work without them, it makes a lot more sense, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly.
That's a good question for you, David. Just quickly from Mark Thompson about establishment, whether you're direct drilling rather than ploughing.
Yes, they were all.
The ground stats.
They were. Some of it was that crop that you can see in the picture. That was direct drilled. We actually cut a crop of rye off of that. The day we cut the rye in a couple of sunny days, baled it up, and direct drilled the kale in the same day, and off it went. Kept it much less weed pressure. The ground tends to hold up a bit better than as well. I've never ploughed for kale, so I don't know, but I can imagine that the cattle's feet go down to the bottom where the plough went, and they're not too bad on there. They're not sinking to. And with young animals, of course, they're much lighter. The difference between, you've half the weight of animal, and that makes such a difference to the depth that they sink into as well. You must remember that too. But the answer is yes, Mark. I think it's more beneficial.
I think it's probably, I could be wrong, but it's probably a calf is somewhere between a cow and a sheep in terms of the mess they'll make. Sheep will still make a hell of a mess on kale in a wet winter, but the depth of hoof print's obviously significantly less. So that is obviously a positive to the calves over cows anyway. Couple of questions about so forage crop choices here. You guys have both, well, kale and red start. So we've now got this kind of fodder beet movement going on as well, and fodder beet could obviously offer you a higher feed value, but I think at a bit more expense to grow the crop, but potentially a bit more of a move towards a more intensive system. So have either of you considered going down that route, or stick with a simple kale?
I think, well, my first idea when I was going to be, when I first thought of outwintering youngstock, it was going to be with fodder beet. That was my first sort of intention. But the more I thought about it, for the first year, I felt as if it was less risk just to go ahead with red start because of the inputs and the physical inputs of spraying and stuff that you need, but also the expertise to actually grow it. I've grown kale here for the last 5 years, Caledonian kale for cows, and it's a piece of cake really. I found I haven't sprayed it once, and it's been really easy. So I felt as if red start for me was the least amount of risk. But obviously, when you compare the yield and all the rest of it of fodder beet and the feed quality, then it becomes more of an option. But I wouldn't rule it out. In fact, I might even switch to fodder beet next year. I think the red start was fine, but then the problem is, or if you can call it a problem, is if you've got greater yield, then the stock are in the same place for more time. If cows will get through the same acreage pretty quickly, but if you've got calves eating huge yields of fodder beet, then maybe they're standing around poaching in the same place. Who knows? That's maybe a question for people that are already doing that, but I wouldn't rule it out whatsoever. No.
I think the first year we did it, we did have some fodder beet. We had 20% of the area was basically a strip of fodder beet down one side of the field. And when the calves got onto that, it took them a while to get into it, but once they got into it, it did make a difference. And that was my first experience of growing fodder beet up here. Last year, we thought, right, this is great, we'll do a bigger area of fodder beet. And we tried direct drilling it, but it's got a fickle, beet in general has got a fickle crop. Any sight of any weeds in it, it gets, the competition's too much, and you seem to be forever going through it with a sprayer. So this year we took the decision that I wasn't going to take that risk. But I still hear what people say and what Duncan's saying, the amount of energy you get out of fodder beet's massive. And I think for calves, if you could have at least a proportion of the diet as fodder beet, it probably would make a difference to their growth. There's just so much energy in it to keep them going. And I suppose if it's only a proportion of the diet, the fence is still going to move further forwards each day, so you've maybe got a bigger area. But I'd be interested to hear people's experiences who've grown it this winter with all the more severe frosts that we've had and how they got on. So if anybody's got any comments as to that, because there's been a lot of chat of, defoliating, taking the leaves off it with the weather, and how much the leaves actually contribute. Has it made a difference to the grazing of it and the output from it? So if anybody's got any comments in that regard, I'd be fascinated to know. So it would be a good idea, I think, fodder beet if you could do it. Just I'm wary about the reliability of getting right the way through the winter on it, possibly.
Okay, thank you, David. I think you mentioned you touched on compensatory growth on the basis that your cattle or your young stock are going onto rye and then onto grass. Presumably, they do motor on when they get to grass in the spring.
Yeah, they will. They just start flying. I think I alluded to the fact that we didn't manage to finish many last year, but I think that was more down to our grass management than the actual animals themselves. And we've conscious we need to get a lot more clover into our grass swards to finish the job. But yeah, they do grow really well when they get onto the grass, and even they start to get a bit more of a shine on them even once you get the longer days towards the end of the winter, and when the sun comes out, it's warmer. You start to see a difference in them even then. They don't eat as much either. They're not needing as much energy to do what they need to do. So yeah, I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, just a quick question here about feeding the forage and how you're feeding it. So you're both supplementing your kale with silage. So is that in ring feeders or trailers or is it bales in the field beforehand but ring feeders on them, or?
Yeah, that's what we've been doing. Yeah,
we're the same. With
so theoretically, if you get it right, you don't have to go in with a tractor. So
yeah, that's the theory. Calves, it's the cows. It's much easier to manage the cows on the kale. I suppose you can ration a cow a bit better, and a cow is not so fussy about what it eats in general terms. Whereas the calves, if you've underdone the calves for a day, by God, you'll know it, because you probably find the next day they won't be behind the string. And our calves are pretty quiet. All they've known since birth is a single string. They've been grazed in mobs in the summer, paddocks divided up, one electric string. That's all they've known. So they know the system. They're used to people moving them every day and interacting with them. So they're very quiet when you're in among them, even on the kale. But if they haven't been fed enough, and particularly if the weather's a bit grim, they'll be out. So we tend to be generous and make sure they've got plenty. Whereas I suppose with cows, you're more concerned about condition score and you're trying to manage their intake a bit more with the calves. I think you just got to let them go for it, as it were.
Yeah, so be a bit more generous with the calves than you would with the cows anyway. I think that should answer Peter's question there. You both mentioned briefly your transition, how you went from like cow and calf in the autumn to calf on the kale come winter time. You want to very briefly just talk about that kind of transition onto it and then off again?
Yeah, well, the sort of system that we use, the cows and calves are rotational grazed all the way through the summer. So like David, our calves are used to hot wire. They're brought in, they are given quiet wean nose paddles for weaning. They're weighed at that point. They then go back outside to the paddocks with their mothers. They're brought in the following week. The paddles are brought out. They are vaccinated for pneumonia and they're wormed. In between times, between the paddles going in and paddles coming out, they're fed silage in the paddocks with our hustler, which transitions them on to silage. They then go back out the paddocks once they've been weaned. They're still behind the single wire and we didn't really have any escapees. So they're on decent grass and the silage. They then got floated over to Ingleston where they got the same silage, and then they got transitioned on to the Red Star. So the silage is a bit of a constant in between times, and then the sort of idea on the way out was something similar, and we're sort of doing that now because we've had to fast forward the exit off of the crop. So they were getting silage all the way through and they're now getting silage onto deferred grass, and then once the grass picks up maybe in March or April, they'll get a little bit more silage before they transition onto the better grass. So silage has been a constant.
Okay. You much the same, David?
No, with our weaning scenario, we're a bit lagging behind the clever guys at the minute. We haven't tried any of these quiet wean things. We tend to, well, the cattle are mob grazed all summer, and one lot we got till I think the end of October, and the other lot we got to mid-November. Last year we could have kept them out longer, but just it suited to pull them off the grass then. Cows are taken off and taken away to another part of the farm, and calves, just because of where the handling systems are and things, they go in the shed that they used to go in for the winter, as it were, just for a couple of days, 2-3 days, just to check the rear tags, make sure everything's fine and whatnot, and settle them down a bit, and then they were just punted straight out onto the kale at that point. Well, they were put onto the kind of run back area at one end of the field with access to silage and just given a wee bit of kale. And they tend to just pick at the kale for the first couple of days, but after that they just get straight into it. And yeah, it's pretty quick, really. Like that. Yeah, so we've a bit of work to do there with the weaning, how we smooth that a bit out. I haven't quite sussed that one yet.
Yeah, just the logistics of the kind of whole system, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think you're making pretty good progress with it. While you were talking about your regenerative dreams, David, here's a question from Jim Logan about whether root crops will be part of a regenerative system in 5 years' time.
As he's been lugging in on the conversations in our office. I don't know, and honestly, it was a conversation last week. It was a brief conversation this afternoon. I honestly don't know. There's a simple answer. If you look at
we did talk about it.
Yeah,
we did talk about the potential of moving to more of a kind of multi-species, like whole TMR type crop that you could potentially grow a big area of and feed to young stock if that worked. And that might be more of the answer where you could get to, I suppose, in 5 years' time.
Yeah, I wondered about growing. Next year, I've got various ideas around my head as to how to. It's giving the calves a big enough, dry enough bit every day, and it's fine when the weather's dry and frosty. It's fine when it's not raining overhead, but when you get these incessant days of rain, like we got at the start of the winter this year, and before, you know, another period through the winter where it's just mud every day, and it's hard to get them to get to the drier bit. They've got to walk back through the bit you've just given them. One idea we have is to actually plant the crop in strips, and have kale going across the field, followed by a strip of another cover, multi-species something, whether it can give any nutritional benefit to the cattle or not, or whether it just gives an area that's not getting tramped on as much and is fresh every day, a bit like a fresh bed every day. I suppose the choices are quite limited for the winter. What's going to be winter hardy enough, besides fodder beet, kale, red start and other brassicas? What crops are going to be there through the winter to provide a nutritional supplement outside? And grass, of course, that's the other alternatives. Strips of grass, maybe.
Right, we've still got an awful lot of questions, but we should probably also try and keep moving. So the next thing we want to discuss is whether outwintering could work for your businesses. I think we've got a poll. Have we got a poll, Beth, for this one?
Yep, poll's there, so if you'd like to vote on that now.
So based on what you've heard from the two speakers, what do you think's the most important factor in a successful system?
We've got most of the answers in there now, John.
Yeah, just go for it then. That's quite interesting result. So I've sort of got this kind of theory in my head, which I think it might be complete nonsense, but I'll go with it anyway. So I think if you've got 2 out of 3 of those things right, I think your system can probably work. So if you've got the right cattle and the right feed, and potentially a poorer site, I think it could still work. Or the wrong cattle, the right feed, and a good site could still work. What are your two thoughts on that, David and Duncan? Is it all about breed?
I'll let David go first with that one.
How generous of you, Duncan. I don't think it's so much. I mean, we've got some pure Simmentals in there. There's Simmental cross Solaire. There's Charolais crosses in there. There's Angus crosses. There's all sorts in there. We find the most important thing at the minute has been making sure the calves, if the calves are too small at the start of the winter, those are the ones that struggle. We kind of reckon 300 kilos is the cutoff. any less than that, we'll just get rid of them at the start. There's no point. Now we've discovered that in the last couple of years that they just really struggle. They just can't take enough feed in to keep themselves going sufficiently. Site-wise, we're lucky. We've got some very sandy ground, and we started off the whole process on the sandiest field on the farm because I thought, well, if we can make it work there, we've got a fighting chance with that. But as time goes on, we're not yet at the point of, probably weren't the best of fields this winter. Next winter we've got a really good big flat dry field to do it in with lots of shelter, which is nice. But I think as time goes on, we'll start moving towards the field that when we first started 2 or 3 years ago we would never think about wintering cattle on. But I think we just changed the proportion of land that you've got. I think if you alter the run back area, or where the run back area is versus where the feed is, I think you can manage it differently. You just maybe have to prepare to not have exactly the same setup as you had the winter before. That would be my take on it. That'd be my take on it.
I totally agree. I think the cattle and the breed is the least important thing. As much as I'm a bit of an Angus fanatic, I don't, and clearly native breeds are probably going to fare better in the system. I think that's the least important factor. The first and foremost needs to be the feed and the site. They need to be properly fed for the conditions, and obviously a good site with proper shelter and decent soil and all the rest of it. That's fundamental. Other thing maybe to raise is, if you're going to go ahead with this sort of thing, is to have a plan B. One of the reasons I felt as if this was a good year to try this was because I knew that going ahead I might not have a plan B. I might not have extra sheds to try it. So I felt as if it didn't work, then I've got sheds to bring them into if it doesn't work. So I think that's worth raising, that it's a plan B is really important. But certainly I would say feed in the site is way ahead of the cattle themselves.
Yeah, so like contingency plans obviously essential for like the spells of weather we've been getting this winter. But that doesn't, obviously it's potentially a shed, but for people that don't have a shed, and that's the reason for this system, your contingency plan could just be like a grass field with like a well-sheltered grass field that you put them on for a few days and feed them a bit of silage. If it's just getting them off the kale for 48 hours or something like that, that's a benefit. Or even a kind of wooded area that you can get them a bit of shelter for just for a short period of time. It seems to be this kind of 48 hours of like constant wind and rain that we get on and off through the winter that turns the fields into a real mess. So okay. Yeah, so could outwintering young stock work for your business? Whether the feed, the cattle, the site and the reason are all important to consider. Here are some other things that potentially might sway your decision. So I think the speakers have touched on most of these. Different crop options, feed options, breeds, your target market, weights and health benefits, shelter, contingency planning, soil types, infrastructure, and dry lies and runbacks seem to be a big issue anyway. So just looking back at the questions here, there's been a few questions about bulling weights. So you're both presumably bulling heifers that are on the kale. And are you still hitting the target weights that you've always aimed for?
Well, as we said at the start, this is my first year, but I expect to, yeah. I think we're calving at 2 years old, so these heifers are going to be bulled, you know, in probably beginning of June, mid-June. I'm trying to reduce the overall weight of the cow herd as well. So our overall cow weight at the moment is 676 kilos. I like to be closer to 600, probably maybe 625, 650, around about there. So I think there's a lot of people speak about getting heifers up to bulling weight, and I can totally understand that. But sometimes it's done to the detriment of, you know, if you're pushing heifers really, really hard so that they calve at 2. I'm not sure if that's really, you know, in their best interests long term, if their feet go all wrong because they've been shoveled barley at them left, right, and centre. So I'm quite comfortable with the weights as I can see. I obviously haven't weighed them yet. I'm quite comfortable with how they are at the moment, and I'm quite confident that they'll reach a acceptable bulling weight. Certainly once they hit the grass, I'm expecting them to fly, and up till now, the last few years have been bulling up in the high 300s, and I'm not just overly concerned about them being too small, to be honest. Most of the ones that we've sort of earmarked for bulling were the ones that are the highest weaning weights anyway. So, you know, most of them are well over 300 without creep off their mothers. So, you know, they haven't got a great deal to gain between, you know, weaning and June. You know, that's basically 7 months. So, you know, they don't have to gain a great deal for me to, you know, to be heavy enough, I would have thought.
Okay. Now we're still having people to come in on the discussion and share their experiences. So if you'd like to do that, just use the raise hand icon, and Beth will bring you in, and you can tell us about what you've tried, or if you're looking to try outwintering, and ask the panelists some questions. Okay. Yeah, David, you're bulling heifers that are presumably straight off the kale as well, then, are you?
We're trying. We think that's the one point where we're. I think we haven't quite been as brave as Duncan to be bulling them as small as that, and I think it's something that we need to change. We need to be braver with the heifers coming off and seeing what actually does get in calf, rather than aiming for a weight. It might be part of the transition in the next few years. Will eventually be calving outside with the cows, which will then necessitate a later calving period. So that might offer more opportunities to get more of that. We'll get some of them bulled to calve down at 2, but this year we probably think with the harsher winter, we might end up having to just leave some of them and calve them down at 2.5 instead, which seems a bit of a faff. But if the overall goal is to cut the cost out of the system and have an economic system, then personally I'm less concerned about pushing things in the short term. Longer term, I think we will get there. But we've gone through a huge transition in the herd in the last 2 or 3 years of how we do things, and we're still ironing out a lot of that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think got a question here from John Ritchie about breaking the mob into weight ranges, presumably just as a way of managing more suitable ages together to increase animal performance, but obviously at the cost of an awful bit more work. But have you thought about that, David, with your big numbers? Or?
Not with the very briefly, but as you say, we do split the cows up into leaner ones and the heifers, in calf heifers, so they get a bit more feed. And then the older cows and the fitter ones, they're on a different line of kale and they get a bit less. But with the calves, we found since going to the mob grazing and stopping creep feed, we're actually having the most even batch of calves at weaning that we've had before. So we used to get, you know, some real thumpers that would be massive weights and some runts at the bottom, and it was basically the ones that bullied their way into the creep and the ones that never got the creep, and then the rest were in the middle. Since we've stopped the creep and started grazing the cows a different way, we've the calves are much more even. There's far fewer big ones at the top end and hardly any runts at the bottom, really. So they're very level going on. But if you think about it, if you put cattle in the shed, the first thing you want to do is make sure they've got enough space, whether it's space to lie down, feed trough space, etc. But we've got 180 animals across a kale face that's 250 meters long. And when you're moving the fence every day, you can be at the other end of the field, having moved the whole fence, and the calves are just crunched up in the first third of the field still, if they're not following it. They don't need a lot of space when they're on the kale to feed. So moving them into smaller batches it would do one thing and it would create work. I don't think it would make any difference to growth rates whatsoever. They seem very happy and content as one big mob.
Yeah, and when you say you've already got other mobs on the farm, and if you've got sheep as well, you've got sheep on forage crops, you've suddenly got yourself an awful lot of different groups to get around each day. So,
which is fine as long as they all stay behind the fence. You can get one mob break out. Well, there's an hour and a half wasted putting it all back together again.
No, they always break out on the day that you don't want them to as well, don't they?
Yep.
So a question here from Jim Logan about weaning, about weight gains. I think we kind of touched on that briefly, but if you're putting things away in the summer, you said as like forward stores, what sort of weights are you getting to?
Off the top of my head, it would be well over 500, 550 kilos for a lot of them. It's pretty impressive what they'll do. And by the time you get to the end of the summer, you'd be up at, well, you're on the cusp of whether you could sell them as a just about finished animal or put them away to somewhere else just to put the last bit of gloss on there, bit of fat on them.
If you could put them in the shed for a month with a bit of barley, they would definitely finish. So.
It gets mentioned a few times, yes.
But you'll let someone else do that for you.
Yeah, it just doesn't, that part of the system's history for us, it just doesn't work. So.
No, that's good. Stick to the system and go with it. So this question here from Michael Blanche about deferred grazing. So could deferred grazing work kind of in the shoulders of the season? So could your calves go onto that ahead of the kale and then like you're doing, Duncan, afterwards?
Yeah, well, there was one group, well, the group of heifers that are on the red start at the moment, they are from multiple bulling groups, obviously. So one of the bulling groups pre-weaning was on deferred grazing and they were getting on great. It was a silage field that never took the second cut off of it, and they were on basically deferred grazing all the way through up to weaning and then transitioning on to red start. So that worked well. I think I'd be a little bit concerned about energy maybe later on through the winter. And also the other thing is snow as well. If it happens to go flat, then you would need your plan B definitely. Whereas kale and things probably stand up a little bit better and there's a wee bit more height as well. So
what's it looking like now, the grass that you've got them on?
It's probably, I call it deferred grazing, but they've probably had the good of it already. They're probably more, their diet's probably 90% silage, to be honest. So it's I would say it's probably not a great part of their diet, to be honest, at the moment now. They weren't exactly strip grazed through it, so they've sort of picked away at anything that was good. Probably a variation of time and several other factors meant that we didn't have time to actually strip graze it as you would usually do. So we ended up just giving them big blocks, and yeah, so they've picked away at it and picked the best of it, but their main diet's coming from silage.
Okay, so we've got one more poll this evening. So, assuming everyone's been, well, I'd like to think everyone's been sold on this excellent system tonight. If that's not the case, what would be your main reasons for not outwintering young stock on your farm? How are we looking, Beth?
I'll just give them a few more seconds, see if I can get a few more votes in. Most of you have voted now. Okay, I think we're good, John.
Okay, it's fairly convincingly the mud and the mess, and I suppose this today wouldn't have helped anyway, that's for sure. So I think the mud, yeah, the mud's definitely an issue, and both speakers have raised this issue of the sort of dry lie, how to manage a dry lie, and whether that's a case of giving stock a bigger area and keeping them moving quicker across your farm, or having multiple sides of the field that can be grazed. But I suppose equally you need shelter as well to consider. So yeah, we can't do an awful lot about the mud. But what do you think, Duncan?
Yeah,
are you surprised by those results or not?
No, not really. No. I think if you've got all the sheds and the straw and the equipment and all the rest of it, I think it's going to be quite a difficult thing to pull yourself away from, because it's so easy. But David might be able to tell you a little bit about that, how if you've got the stuff to do it with, then how do you transition away from using the infrastructure that you've got. But for me, as I said, I've got the sheds to use, but I feel as if maybe potentially going forward I might not have. So I wanted to know whether I could get away without using them, and I think I've probably answered the question for myself that I think I can. The mud's obviously the thing that concerns a lot of people, and if you've outwintered cows before, you'll know if you've done a decent job of it, the cows are as clean as, they're far cleaner than they would be inside. If they stand up on a dry frost today, the dust's falling off of them, and they've got there's hardly a mark on them. They're absolutely spotless. So if you can make a good job of the young stock, they'll be the same. And okay, your ground will get a wee bit muddy, but if you're constantly shifting onto a new spot all the time, it's never really that bad. The problem is when you've got, if your water troughs and ring feeders and stuff, that can be a bit of an issue. So you've just got to be a wee bit smart and either have different sites for water, or have hard standings in different places potentially, or you have to try and think of a way to try and tackle that. But the mud in in general, I wouldn't say is as big a problem as what it seems.
Yeah, it's get the infrastructure right and the setup right, and hope to minimise the amount of mud. Yeah, something we've been talking about, this idea that soil type isn't suitable on your farm, which is definitely a lot of places. It's this idea that if it's not right on your farm, then find a farm that does have the right soil type. Find an arable farm that is looking to get some stock back on the land, and see if you can start a bit of collaboration with them. We've kind of, someone like David with a good scalp of sandy ground, perfect. So is that something you'd consider in the future, David, once you've really perfected the system?
You mean taking on other stock to I wouldn't discount it. I wouldn't discount it at all. I think I'd need to be a few more years down the line of getting it right before we got to that point. But I think, and the other thing that isn't in the poll, and is one of the biggest challenges that we've had is mindset. If you just want to drive tractors and work in a shed all winter, you're not going to want to go out and do cattle outside every single day, because it is every single day. You put them in a shed and they're not going to escape unless something goes badly wrong. It's all very predictable. You can go out at 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning, and by 8:30, you're done and you're back in the house, and that's you. Whereas just a couple of weekends ago, one of our guys was out doing the stock on the weekend, and I happened to go for a toodle around on the Sunday afternoon, looked across to the field that the calves were all in, and figured out the calves had all escaped. So there's an hour on a Sunday afternoon just putting them back in. It's no big deal, but it's getting the mindset. The change of mindset is a big thing. You can overcome the mud, you can overcome the infrastructure, you can overcome pretty much everything on that list if you really want to. But if your mind doesn't want to do it, you can have the best soil, the least mud, and whatever, and you won't succeed. I think that's the most important thing. You've got to want to do it, and I wanted to do it, and we will succeed at it. But that's the biggest challenge, I would say. What about you, Duncan? What do you think?
Yeah, definitely, I would say so. Yeah, but well, speaking from a sort of young farmer's sort of hat on, sometimes you've got not much choice but to figure out ways of making things work. So if you've not got the funds behind you to buy all the kit, you've just got to find a way of making it work. So that that mindset's sort of forced upon you, if that makes sense. But I can see if you've got staff and various things, that it can be difficult to do. But you get good days and bad days. But if you're out in a bonny frosty morning, it's actually a joy to walk through and shift a few electric fence posts. It's not hard work, and it's really nice to actually do, to be honest. But obviously you get some bad days when it's an absolute mess and you're coated head to toe in mud and stuff. But it just is what it is, Just got to get on with it.
Okay, so any final questions for the panel? There's one here that came up earlier, just a quick one about feeding forage crops that are frozen. I remember hearing something about that years ago. You shouldn't feed it to kale to sheep that's frozen. Have you come across any problems?
No, calves haven't bothered them at all.
No.
But they've got access to silage all the time, so it's not just we would like to think that the diet our calves are getting is roughly 50% kale, 50% good quality silage. So they're not solely on the kale, but even on a frosty morning, the first thing they do when you move the fence is eat the kale. The one or two of them might go and eat the silage, but they eat the kale first. That's where all the energy is.
Right, another one, yeah, about mineral supplementing the calves. Are you putting out kind of feed licks or bolusing, or what are your thoughts on minerals?
I just use Chrysalis Cattle Booster, so that'll give them energy, and it's mineralized as well. So it's probably a bit of a easy solution, I would say. Probably more expensive than it maybe needs to be, but it's easy.
We just put out a free access iodine mineral just in a trough near the water trough, and they don't take very much of it. So you tend to think if they wanted it, if they needed it, they would take more of it, but they don't take a great deal.
Yeah. So, yeah, question from earlier, Duncan Morrison saying, yeah, do they need the forage crop, or just kind of house them on stubble and feed a similar ration to what you would have done inside?
I've wondered about doing this. I did wonder about doing this when the weather turned really, really bad, putting them on a stubble field, lining bales up and effectively strip grazing them on bales of silage instead. As a kind of, that would be our version of plan B, instead of putting them in a shed, as it were. It's much more expensive. The feed cost goes up, the silage drags the feed cost up quite a lot. That would be the only reason not to do it. But if you didn't want the bother of a forage crop where your kale doesn't grow very well because you've got a lot of club root or something like that, then that would be a kind of sensible option, I think. But I think you'd still want to kind of do the strip grazing or strip movement bit. I think if you've just got them, unless you've got a very sandy field, if you've just got them mooching around one big stubble field all winter and you're getting in and out with tractors and trailers with feed and whatnot, the mess is going to be unbelievable. I think that's one of the things you've got to watch if they're outside. When we get it wrong and we have to start moving bales around or take a trailer or something like that, the mess just goes up almost exponentially very quickly as soon as you take machines and heavy machines in the field. So the answer is yes, I think it could be done if you were as a starter thing. It would certainly be beneficial to the cattle versus putting in a shed, I think. And
you could, presumably if you did the bales with some deferred grass or something, that would be kind of a next step, would it not?
Yeah, and I think people do that. Yeah, I think that'd be fine.
But I suppose the question is, are they going to get enough out of the silage and the grass to actually grow on a young beast?
It would have to be very, very good silage, I think, and that's where the kale compensates, because I think the kale's high ME, it's a lot of protein in it. You're getting the bits that you need to get a bit of growth. Whereas I think you might struggle just with silage to get the growth.
Yeah, because your kale is essentially replacing your cereal, isn't it, from the ration?
Pretty much.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We've got quite an amusing question coming here. It's anonymous because, yeah, because he's wondering if we think it's totally daft. So basically, they're heck drilling kale into well-grazed grass with no Roundup, and whether that would work out.
Just got to give it a go, I suppose. Sounds a little bit daft in a way, but
I've had enough experience of grass coming back that's been sprayed off with Roundup, let alone not using it at all.
I think I don't know if I'd choose kale, but I find kale a very fickle crop. Back to one of the reasons for us wanting to do this is that our arable land has been mined. We've mined it for decades. Some of these fields haven't seen livestock in earnest for 40 or 50 years. And we see that, there was a picture I saw recently, somebody standing next to a crop of kale, and of course the stuff was about 7 foot tall. Well, we never managed to grow kale like that because our fields just aren't fertile enough. But I wonder if some of these more vigorous brassicas like rape, maybe the red star or swift or something like that, might do the job. You need something to get on top of the grass when it does come back, possibly. I don't know if I'd do it with kale. I think it would sulk too much.
Yeah, and if you could get a bit of grass in the bottom, obviously it's adding your big chunk of your forage to the ration, isn't it?
Trying to hold the stock up much better in the winter too.
Yeah, exactly. It's still holding the ground conditions. I think we did talk briefly about whether you could do a strip of kale and a strip of grass, didn't we?
Yeah. What I suppose, because we're on arable fields, it would have to be young grass, and I'm not quite sure how the young grass, what it would look like time you came to the winter and how it would hold the cattle up. I think if you're on permanent pasture, that's maybe more of an option.
Well, maybe that's an experiment for this summer, David.
We could just get the anonymous person to try it, surely. Be brave, whoever you are.
Okay, so we're just going to wrap up quite soon. So next steps really is a survey link will be emailed out the next day or two. The recording will be available shortly, and a bit of an idea, if it's of any interest to people, is we could potentially start a bit of a WhatsApp group for people that are this, if they want to share their experiences and their questions with each other. A lot of these things, it's just basically trial and error. So if someone else has tried it and found out the best way, then it saves you making that same mistake. And I know definitely our two panelists have found that it's a case of learning from mistakes. It's not really a textbook for outwintering young stock yet, anyway. That's for sure. So we'll give some more details of that in a few days, anyway. And just to wrap up, say a big thank you to David and Duncan for coming on and sharing their experiences. Hopefully everyone's got something out tonight, and I look forward to seeing an awful lot more calves outside next winter.